I'm Nathan, 27, and I have exactly two Christmas stories, the one I grew up inside of, and the one I've been quietly rewriting since the day I realized you can choose where to set your table. Until this year, my family's version always starred my Aunt Linda. She has a voice that cuts through music and cheerful chaos like a sharp bell, and she narrates everything. How the potatoes should be mashed, how sweaters should fit, and, most of all, how I should feel about myself. If you've got a relative who mistakes control for love, you know her type. As kids, we learned her mood before we finished our coats, whether we'd get a tight smile and a "there he is," or a long, theatrical sigh followed by, "Oh good, you made it." The joke was that the sigh was our family wreath, reliable, evergreen, slightly depressing if you think about it too long. This year, my mother asked me to be kind, just for the night. She said it soft, rehearsed. I think she wanted Christmas Eve to feel intact, the way it did when Grandma was alive, and kept a hand on Linda's shoulder. Grandma had a way of making space open up around people. Even Linda lowered her voice when Grandma looked at her. After Grandma passed last spring, the air felt different in the house. Thinner, like the ceiling got higher but the warmth fell out. Everyone else looked for her in ornaments and recipes. I found her in legal folders and crisp clauses because she'd made me executor of her trust. It was a job I almost refused. The lawyer's office smelled like lemons and effort. The list of responsibilities pressed against my chest like a second spine. But I said yes because Grandma asked me months earlier on her porch, bare feet against the boards, night bugs thudding against the screen. She squeezed my hand and said, "You see people as they are and still look for what they could be. That's a trustee." That line kept me steady through the summer's storm of paperwork and whispered phone calls. It also taught me the difference between justice and victory. If you've been in a family where one person collects the narrative, you learn to author in margins. I grew up mastering small escapes, a second walk around the block, an offer to take out the trash that needed no taking out, visits to Grandma that always lasted one more cup of tea than I'd planned. Linda preferred my cousins, especially her son Tyler, not because they were better people, but because they mirrored back her vision of what successful, grateful children looked like. Tyler always had the newest thing, and he wore his good fortune like a badge. "He earned it," she'd say. Some of us believe in excellence. When we were teenagers, she said that while taking a video of Tyler's pile of presents to send to her friends. The camera swung past me and the two books I'd asked for. She posted it anyway. Every holiday had its small humiliations. There was the year she made a speech about how respect is earned, and then called on us to list one thing we appreciated about her. I said she made good cranberry relish. She frowned because she wanted, "You're the backbone of the family." There was the Christmas I put together a slideshow of family photos, including some from the hospital when Grandma was getting weaker. She interrupted 10 seconds in, "No sad stuff tonight," and switched it to a loop of Tyler's college highlights. She laughed. "We need to keep the energy up." And my mother laughed too, not because it was funny, but because it was safer. Somewhere in my early 20s, I learned to stop offering things that mattered. Bring cookies. Bring extra chairs. Bring nothing fragile. When Grandma died, the fault lines widened. At the will reading, Linda sat in a bright coat like a warning light. She'd been certain, absolutely, cosmically certain, that Grandma's house would be hers outright. Instead, the trust outlined a slower, more careful plan. The house would stay in the family trust until we decided, together, what to do. Any sale or renovations would require consensus from the beneficiaries. There was also a clause that surprised everyone but me, a small discretionary fund to be used for community good in Grandma's name, controlled by the trustee. Me. Linda's face didn't fall so much as sharpen. She squeezed the arm of her chair, smiled at the lawyer, and said, "Well, I'm sure we'll do what's sensible," which in Linda speak means what I've already decided. On the sidewalk afterward, she leaned close, perfume bright and cold. "You're too young for this, Nathan. Don't make a mess of your grandmother's legacy." I nodded because nodding is a language in itself. All summer and fall, I met with the lawyer, walked through the house with an appraiser, and started the tiny fund in Grandma's name. New coats for the kindergarten at her church, a repaired swing at the park where she pushed me when I was small. I didn't post about it. I didn't send an email thread or our family group chat any pictures, because my intention was quiet and stubborn, like Grandma's was. The only person who knew the details was my mother, who listened and cried because it reminded her of her mom in ways that both hurt and healed. "Your aunt is going to hate not being in charge," she whispered once. "I know," I said, "but that's grief, too." Then December came. My mother called the week before Christmas Eve and asked, carefully, if I'd come to Linda's as usual. "Everyone's going," she added, "which is how our family invites you and warns you in one breath." I said yes. I'm not a martyr. I'm just tired of letting other people decide where the meaning of a holiday lives. I also had a plan, not for spectacle, but for dignity. It started with one unexpected thing. I booked the town's little historic venue, an old library turned community hall down the street, for a surprise Coco and Carol's event in Grandma's name on the same night, starting later. Free entry, music from the high school quartet, cookies from Mrs. Ramirez, who'd brought casseroles to my grandparents every time they got sick. The quiet fun paid for everything. I spoke to the venue manager a week in advance, and we made a contingency call script in case I needed it. "Just in case there's interference," I said, trying to find a word that didn't sound like an accusation. She raised an eyebrow like she'd seen 100 families in our exact shape before. "Understood. We'll be ready." Christmas Eve at Linda's looked exactly like it always does. A table that could have fed a small village, decorations that were slightly too perfect, magazine tidy instead of memory warm, and a playlist which allowed no slow songs. When I arrived, Linda's eyes did a quick calculation. She hugged me while looking over my shoulder at who might be behind me. "Nathan," she said, crisp as a new bill. "So good you could make it." The living room was loud and sugar bright. Cousins, aunts, the clink of glasses, the kind of laughter that turns into a crowd noise rather than a feeling. Tyler came in from the porch carrying a box of extra ornaments like he was moving treasure. "Look who decided to be festive," he grinned, tapping my shoulder. "You dress up for once." I looked down at my sweater. It was a normal sweater. He smirked. He still wears the grin of the kid who got away with everything and learned that meant he was important. I brought a single gift, wrapped in plain brown paper with a red ribbon. Inside was a small, framed photo of Grandma in the garden, hair pinned back, holding a ridiculous squash she once grew and laughed about all summer. I'd had the photo restored and printed from the original negative. Grandma looked so alive you almost expected her to blink. The frame had an inscription, her name, the years, and a line she said to me 100 times when I doubted myself. "Start small, but start." The gift was for my mother, the one person who always tried to meet me where I stood. I slid it gently under the tree. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was trying to hold on to a person. Dinner was its usual parade. Linda pointed out who'd brought what, including all the dishes she made and a few she bought and passed off like she hadn't. She asked Tyler about work and nodded loudly when he answered, so the nods felt like applause. When I spoke, she found a way to call it interesting, which in Linda speak is a velvet-lined box with nothing inside. She asked me how playing money manager was going, as if I'd taken up juggling. I said it was going fine. She said, "No small disasters yet," and everyone laughed, because it costs nothing to laugh when the joke's not on you. The living room drifted toward the tree afterward. We have a tradition of going one by one, youngest to oldest, with Linda narrating like an auctioneer. Wrapping paper drifted onto laps. Thank yous were rehearsed. My mother sat next to me and squeezed my hand under a blanket. "I saw the ribbon," she whispered. "You always find the good red." I smiled without thinking. Linda was in her element. "Oh, that's from us, sweetheart," until my present surfaced. Tyler's girlfriend found it under a tinsel avalanche and held it up. "This one's pretty," she said. Linda took it smoothly. Her eyes flicked to the tag. She stared a half-second longer than usual, and I watched the shift, the way she put on the crown in her head. She cleared her throat and turned toward me. "You don't belong here. Give your gift to someone who deserves it," she said. She landed each word like a dart, sweet voice, poisonous point. Conversation paused in concentric circles. The cousins did that small laugh teenagers do when they're trying to figure out which direction to point their faces. Tyler's lips pressed into something that wanted to be a smile and an apology at the same time. My mother said my name softly. Linda reached for the present and, in one fluid motion, handed it to her son. "Tyler's worked so hard this year," she explained, like a teacher dividing stickers. "Let's not pretend otherwise. In a family like ours, the moment after the blow is where the weather changes." There's the gust of shock. Then everyone steadies themselves according to the script. Maybe someone will make a joke. Maybe someone will chide. Maybe someone will say, "Not now." I've been on the receiving end of those small storms for years, and the thing I learned is that not every response belongs on the stage. Some responses work better in hallways, driveways, quiet corners where consequences can hear themselves. So I stood up and gave my mother a look I hoped she understood. "I'm okay." She squeezed my wrist. I said, "I'm going to grab some air." Linda spread her hands as if she'd made a point about maturity. "Good idea," she chirped. "Come back when you're settled." Outside, the night held a clean cold. You could see your breath. The neighborhood looked like December in a snow globe. Porch lights, glitter along the roofline. A distant car, door thumping closed. I walked to my car and sat with my hands on the steering wheel like something might fly out of me if I didn't hold still. I thought about Grandma bending over the soil, patting it like a good dog. I thought about the Will reading and Linda's jaw when she realized the house didn't simply hand itself over. I thought about my mother watching me on that couch, torn between loyalty and love. And I thought about the small party I'd quietly arranged down the street, where Mrs. Ramirez had laid out trays of cookies wrapped in plastic, and the quartet was tuning up in the old reading room under a wreath. The venue manager and I had agreed on a phrase for the cell phone call in case we needed to move it forward. "The library is open." I dialed. The manager answered on the first ring, as if she was standing by the phone. I gave her the phrase. Her voice didn't change, but I could hear a smile. "Understood," she said. "We'll open the doors in 10. I asked her to make one extra call, to a number I'd given her earlier, the only other person who knew the plan. She promised she would. I hung up and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, but there was a steadiness in my face that surprised me. I know some people prefer fireworks when they picture revenge. Mine was simpler. Mine was a door opening where another had just been slammed. When I stepped back inside, the house felt warmer, louder. The present I'd wrapped sat on Tyler's lap, unopened, like a dare. Linda looked pleased with herself in a way that made the room subtly dimmer. She caught my eye and performed concern. "Are we centered?" she asked. I said yes. The cousins drifted back toward their phones. My mother looked at me with a question I answered with a small nod. And then the front door opened again, and my Aunt Marlene, my mother's older sister, who avoids conflict like it's a second job, walked in from the cold though she'd already been there. She had her coat on and her car keys in one hand. She said, in a voice I've only heard twice before, "They're starting down the street." "What's starting?" Linda asked, laughing a little, bracing for a joke that would keep her in control. Marlene didn't smile. "The thing for Mom," she said. "At the old library. They're lighting the tree in the courtyard and the kids are singing." Mrs. Ramirez called me because she said she didn't want the hot chocolate to go to waste. She did not look at me, and I felt that same mix of gratitude and sorrow I always feel around the truly kind. "I'm going," she added, like someone declaring the start of a march. She slipped her arms into her coat like a decision. Silence at a family gathering is strange. It doesn't look like quiet in the real world. It looks like 100 tiny calculations. It sounds like distant jingle bells from somewhere you can't place. Tyler looked at his mother. Linda made a face that said, "Stay." But the room had shifted by an inch, and you could feel the difference like when a plane dips. My cousin Zoe stood first. "Grandma loved the library," she said, voice small and stubborn. She picked up her coat. Then Aunt Teresa, who rarely contradicts Linda, stood, too. "I'll drive," she said, as if saying something less would mean more fighting later. The door opened and opened again. It wasn't a rush. It was a series of polite exits. Shoes thumped softly on the mat. The music in the living room suddenly felt too loud for the number of people listening to it. Linda tried to scoop the air back toward herself. "No one is leaving," she announced, cheerfully tyrannical. "We have dessert. We have the exchange. This is our tradition." But tradition, I've learned, is what we do, not what we're told to do. My mother stood without looking at me. She pulled on her coat and buttoned it with hands that didn't shake. She has the kind of quiet courage you can only see from inside a family. "I'll be back," she said to Linda, and then, almost gently, "if there's anything to come back to." Linda laughed again, but fewer people mirrored it. I didn't gloat. I didn't point at the door and make a speech. I just stood and watched warmth reallocate itself. This was never about making Linda feel small. It was about making room for something bigger to breathe. A family is a lot like a house. You can live there with the windows painted shut and call it safe. Or you can open one and let the heat move where it's wanted. Tyler placed the brown paper present on the coffee table, untouched. He looked at it the way you look at things that have shifted meaning in your hands. "We'll open this when you're calmer," Linda told me, as if she hadn't rewritten the tag herself. She seemed almost giddy, buoyed by the challenge of regaining control. "No one is going anywhere," she repeated, louder now, like the volume might glue people to their seats. That's when the doorbell rang. It wasn't timid. It was the confident ding-dong of someone with authority over the next few minutes. Linda's head snapped toward the entryway as if the house had betrayed her. Tyler set the present down more carefully than I expected. In the hallway, a shape moved behind the frosted glass, and I recognized the outline before the knob turned. The venue manager's wool coat, the kind you wear when your job is both hospitality and decisions. She stepped inside when the door opened, cheeks pinked from the cold, a cap of snow on her scarf. "Hello," she said, warm but businesslike. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm from the community hall down the street. We're starting the event for Mrs. Hill." She paused, kind enough to let Grandma's name settle. "And quite a few people are already arriving. We wanted to make sure the family knew. We have cocoa waiting and room reserved." She looked around the room the way good managers do, not challenging, just inviting. "Everyone's welcome." The effect was immediate and gentle, like a whisper at the center of a crowd. A few more cousins stood. Two neighbors, who always drifted over to Linda's house on Christmas Eve because it felt safer than their own, murmured to each other and reached for their coats. My Uncle Greg, who rarely takes a stand unless it's about the proper way to carve ham, cleared his throat and said, "Your mother loved that old place, Lynn." He put on his hat like it mattered. Even Tyler's girlfriend, who'd never pushed back on anything in her life, slipped her hand into his and said, "I want to go hear the kids sing." Something flashed across Linda's face. Panic, maybe, thin and silver. She stood very straight. "This is ridiculous," she said. "We are in the middle of Christmas. This is our home." The manager nodded like she'd heard that 1,000 times and knew how to step around it. "Of course," she said. "And we'll be there for an hour, and then we'll clean up and lock up. We just didn't want you to miss the carols. There's a memory table if you'd like to bring anything." She glanced, almost imperceptibly, at the brown paper gift on the coffee table. No accusation, just possibility. I bent to pick up my coat. My hands were steady. My mother caught my eye across the room. She didn't know the details, but she knew enough to recognize a chair being pulled out for her and the people she loved. Linda opened her mouth to begin a new paragraph, the kind where she gathers people with a story they don't get a chance to revise. She took a breath. The manager waited, hands clasped, professional patience wrapped around her like another layer of wool. More feet shuffled toward the hall. The music from the Bluetooth speaker stuttered and then stopped, as if the house itself were listening for the next line. And then Linda turned toward me with a look I hadn't seen since I was 12 and refused to trade away the baseball card my grandfather gave me. It wasn't anger. It was offense braided with disbelief, like the world had tilted and I was responsible for gravity. She took one step closer, lowered her voice, and said, "What exactly do you think you're doing here, Nathan?" I opened my mouth to answer. The door behind the manager swung wider, letting in a bite of air and a scatter of voices from the street. Someone laughing, someone calling a name, the skirl of a violin warming up, and the room teetered on the edge between two versions of the same night. My reply was right there on my tongue, simple and careful, the truth scaled to the moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even move closer. I just said, "I'm doing what she would have done," and tilted my head toward the door like it was a path instead of a challenge. Linda's eyes narrowed like I'd offered a riddle instead of a sentence. For a second, I saw the room reflected in her pupils, the coats half on, my mother buttoning the last button with that stubborn care, the manager waiting in her wool and patience. Linda's hand tightened on the back of a chair. "No one is being manipulated out of my home on Christmas," she said, each word bright and hard. "Please stay. Everyone. We've planned a beautiful night." I thought about all the nights that were beautiful because we were told they were. I lifted the brown paper gift off the table and slid it into my coat pocket. It fit, just. Then I turned and walked toward the door without another sentence. It wasn't defiance. It was orientation, like choosing to face a window in a crowded room. Behind me, shoes scuffed and whispers folded into each other. I didn't look back until I reached the entryway. My mother had fallen in beside me. She squeezed my arm once and said, "Don't say anything yet." It wasn't a warning. It sounded like she knew I'd been saving words for too long, and she wanted them to land where they mattered. Outside, the air held the sharp sweetness of cold and cinnamon someone had spilled on a scarf. A little line had formed on the sidewalk. Aunt Marlene in front, Aunt Teresa beside her, Uncle Greg tugging at his hat, cousins nodding to each other the way people do at airports when they've agreed on a gate. We stepped off Linda's porch and down her walkway, the yard lights throwing soft gold onto the snow. Behind us, the door closed with a decisive click. I could almost feel Linda's relief at the sound. Seal the house, keep the narrative. But the street belonged to December now. A neighbor waved from her porch and called, "We're heading there too. Save us seats." The manager led us like an usher, never in front, always just near enough to make sure no one got lost. The old library's entry lanterns wore wreaths. Through the glass, you could see garlands looped along the railings and the glow of a dozen lamps. Someone had hung a banner over the check-in table, in loving memory of Florence Hill, Coco and carols for the neighborhood. When I'd chosen the font last week, I'd cried in the dark over my laptop because fonts shouldn't hurt. Now, seeing it printed, I felt a steadiness lift in my chest like the inverse of panic. Mrs. Ramirez met us at the door with a tray of tiny marshmallows. "For floating," she said, "because details are how you show love when you don't have the right words. We saved some extra for the late arrivals." She winked at me in a way that said she knew exactly what kind of late this was. Inside, the quartet tuned in the corner, their cases half closed like sleeping animals. A group of kids in knit hats clustered near the memory table we'd set up under the big front window. I'd placed a guest book there, 2 pens, and a small sign. Share a story, big or small. Someone had already left a photo of Grandma at the church potluck balancing 3 plates in 2 hands, her eyes laughing. A neighbor wrote, "She taught me to make biscuits that didn't fight back." A man I barely recognized had written, "She never forgot my name when I moved here alone." Beneath the table sat a box labeled coats. "Take what you need." I'd worried there wouldn't be enough sizes. Now, looking at the stack, I was grateful for every tag I'd clipped and every sleeve I'd folded in my living room where the cat tried to help by sitting on the pile. People streamed in behind us. The sound rose, soft winter sounds, muffled by scarves and the way you love someone who isn't in the room anymore. My mother drifted to the memory table and laid her palm flat on the cloth, like checking if stories still kept heat. She picked up the guest book and smiled at a note. Aunt Teresa wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve and then, embarrassed, laughed about her mascara. I found the manager again and thanked her. "You did this," she said. "I'm just the person who unlocks the door." I handed her a folded note, final instructions for the donation jars in the back, the stipend for the quartet. She didn't unfold it, just tucked it into her pocket and said, "I'll make sure it all goes where you intended." At first, I thought I had imagined it, the sound of footsteps that are more posture than footfall. But then Linda's silhouette filled the doorway behind the last group of neighbors. She didn't shake the snow from her boots. She didn't lower her voice for the quiet of the hall. She stepped inside like a high school principal late to an assembly, the kind who expects the room to adjust to her presence. Tyler was a step behind, shoulders stiff, eyes on the floor. When Linda saw the banner, her mouth pulled tight. She was dressed for hosting, a red scarf, a brooch shaped like a snowflake large enough to be a confession. "We're leaving in 10 minutes, she announced to no one and everyone. She stood near the door, not joining the room so much as hovering at it. I didn't go to her. I didn't bring her into the center. I took my mother's hand and walked to the front where the quartet's music stands leaned at a slight angle. The players nodded at me. We'd rehearsed the order of songs the day before. I turned to the room. The quiet that gathered wasn't the hush of fear. It was that gentle bend of attention rooms give when grief is the guest of honor. "Thank you for coming," I said, voice careful. "My name is Nathan. I'm Florence's grandson." Around the edges of the hall, heads nodded in that "I remember you from the garden party" way. She loved this place. She taught me to trace my finger along the spines of the books and pick the one that made my hand tingle. She said that was your mind saying, "Take me home." I kept it short. I told the story about how Grandma organized a neighborhood sing-along here during a blizzard when the power went out, and how she used the librarian's flashlight like a conductor's baton. I thanked the quartet for playing and Mrs. Ramirez for the cookies and the teenagers for their willingness to sing, even though it's a risky thing to open your mouth in front of adults and try to be sincere. I mentioned the coat box, the memory book, and the jars by the door for those who wanted to donate to the elementary school's winter fund. I did not say the word trust or executor or clause. This wasn't about documents. This was about a person whose absence had weight. While the quartet eased into, "O come, all ye faithful," I moved quietly to the memory table and placed my brown paper present in the center. The ribbon made a clean X on the paper. A candle in a jar flickered beside it, the wick drowning and then catching. My mother stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of her sleeve. "Should I open it?" she whispered. I nodded. She tugged at the end of the ribbon carefully the way she taught me when I was small, as if even paper deserves gentleness. The frame slid out, glass catching the lamplight. Grandma's garden face smiled out, ridiculous squash and all. The inscription glinted at the bottom. "Start small, but start." My mother touched the words. She didn't cry. She laughed. The little laugh she gives when something hurts and heals at the same time. She would have loved this, she said. She would have told that squash story twice. I felt Linda before I saw her. The air changed a degree behind my shoulder. She set her bag on the table as if claiming a space. "This is sweet," she said, drawing out the word. "But family time is inside, Nathan. You've made your point." She looked past me at my mother. "Come on, Emma. Everyone's waiting." My mother threaded the ribbon around her finger and didn't lift her eyes. "I'm here," she said simply. It wasn't a challenge. It was a sentence with all of its own feet. Linda tilted her chin toward the banner. "Using her name without consulting me is inappropriate," she said. She kept her voice light for the room, but the edges pressed. "As the senior member of the family, I think we should discuss how these things are handled." I almost smiled at the phrase handled, like grief were a folding chair you could stack and will into a closet. I swallowed once before I answered. "It's a community event," I said. "In her memory." I kept my voice quiet, not to hide, but to make anyone who wanted it lean closer. "There's nothing to manage." Tyler hovered behind his mother like a shadow that wanted to be its own shape. He looked at the guest book and then away and then back again. "Grandma liked the library," he muttered, defensively to no one, as if he needed it to count as an opinion. Linda touched his elbow, and he straightened. We could have stayed there, locked in a polite tug-of-war of phrases, if not for Aunt Marlene, who had discovered bravery as if from a lost drawer. She stepped to the memory table, lifted the guest book, and said to the little crowd around us, "Would anyone like to share a story?" She didn't look at Linda. She didn't look at me. She looked at a kid with a beanie pulled low. The boy cleared his throat and said, "She helped me with my reading every Tuesday when I had to stay late." He spoke directly into the mug of cocoa in his hands like it could hold his voice for him. "She didn't tell anyone I mixed up B and D." Laughter hummed in the room, small and true. The kid's mother squeezed his shoulder. "See?" Marlene beamed. "That's a Christmas story." The quartet slid into Silent Night. People sang soft. The hall gathered the sound and gave it back warmer. In the middle of the second verse, I noticed Linda looking not at me, but at the jar on the table with the little slot cut into the top. She was counting the folded bills with her eyes. Sometimes you don't realize what someone watches until you see what holds their attention. Her jaw set. When the song ended, she clapped twice and said, "All right, lovely," with the energy of someone deciding where to put a wall. "Before anyone gets too swept up," she continued, "I think it's important to remember that Florence's affairs are not a public matter. Nathan has been enthusiastic, but there are proper channels for memorials." She straightened the edge of the tablecloth by half an inch, a gesture so small and controlling it could only have been meant for me. "We will be hosting dessert at our home shortly. Let's wrap this up." There was a small stir, the kind you hear when a flock notices movement, not because they want to follow, but because they want to register the change. I realized then that I wasn't the only one who had prepared for this. The manager stepped forward with a man beside her, thin, coat collar up, carrying a leather folder. "I'm sorry to interrupt again," she said, "but Mr. Abrams just arrived." She gestured to the man. "He asked to speak to the family at the event when everyone was here. He said it would be brief." Linda's smile went rigid, the way ice goes shiny before it cracks. "We are not having legal conversations in a public hall," she said. This is extremely inappropriate. Mr. Abrams looked gently apologetic and also immovable, the way good lawyers look when they've already read the next 5 lines of the page. I promised Florence I would deliver a letter to her family on Christmas Eve, in a room that was not anyone's living room, he said. He didn't raise his voice, but the shape of his words carried. She was very specific. She asked that it be read where neighbors could hear if they wished. I felt my mouth go dry. I hadn't known about any letter. The trust I'd handled for months didn't mention Christmas Eve or public words. For a second, I thought maybe he had the wrong haul. But the way he looked at me, steady, kind, like he'd seen my grandmother write my name on an envelope, made my stomach tip. He opened the folder. Inside lay a thick envelope sealed with a tiny red sticker. In Grandma's loops and corners, the front read, "To my daughters, my grandchildren, and whoever shows up when cookies are free." Someone laughed, a sudden release of tension that made other people laugh too. Mr. Abrams held the envelope up so the light caught the red square. "If you prefer, we can wait," he offered, not to Linda but to the room. "I can read this at the end, after songs." From the corner of my eye, I saw Linda's fingers twitch toward the envelope like a flicker. "You will not," she said low. "This is a private matter." He nodded as if he'd expected that sentence and had already set down a place for it. "Florence anticipated that concern," he said gently. "She wrote this letter for both places, the table where people break bread and the hall where they pass coats to one another. She told me that if either place is full of people who loved her, both places have earned the right to hear." The quartet, not sure whether to play, let their bows hover above the strings. In the back, Mrs. Ramirez arrested her hand mid-sprinkle over a plate of cookies and held it there in attention like a cartoon character smelling pie. The kids in hats pressed closer, drawn by the possibility that a grown-up might read something dramatic out loud. My mother slid her palm into mine with a small squeeze I felt all the way up my arm. Linda's face went through microclimates: surprise, calculation, irritation, determination, then settled on the weather she wears most: certainty. "Absolutely not," she said. "If there is a letter, it should be read in our home with the family. That's how we do things." She put her hand flat on the envelope as if it were a runaway napkin. Mr. Abrams didn't tug. He just tilted his head and said, "May I ask you to remove your hand, Mrs. Collins?" His voice had the quiet of someone who knows which words carry weight. "The letter belongs to the people it names. In a different year, in a different December, that might have worked. The insistence on our home, the bright invitation reframed as an order. But people had already taken off their coats and put down their heavy feelings. You could feel the room deciding not with a cheer, but with a lean. Aunt Marlene said, Florence loved a good letter, like it was a vote. Uncle Greg, hand still on his hat, added, she read them at the table every year, which was true. The thankful letters at Thanksgiving, the Christmas card from the neighbor deployed overseas. The manager stepped back, letting the room keep its own momentum. I thought about stepping in. I thought about making a speech to grease the edges. Then I remembered the porch and the night bugs thudding the screen and my grandmother's hand over mine when she called me a trustee. Trust is a verb before it's a noun, she'd said once, after a Sunday sermon about action. Not everything needs a defender. Sometimes you just need a witness. Nathan, Linda said, turning back to me like she could still get the scene to pivot if her words found the right hinge. If you care about your grandmother's legacy, you will stop this. Bring everyone back to the house. We'll read whatever that is with just us. That's how it's done. Her voice was persuasive on its surface and panicked underneath, like a polished floor over ice. I opened my mouth, ready this time. I wasn't going to apologize or explain. I was going to say, her legacy includes the people you don't invite. I was going to say, you don't get to decide who belongs. I was going to say, start small, but start, and let the sentence stand like a little cornerstone. Excuse me, came a voice from the doorway, breathless and bright. Everyone turned. Tyler's girlfriend had hustled back from the coat rack, cheeks flushed, phone in hand. I think you should hear this first, she said, eyes darting between Linda and me and Mr. Abrams. She swallowed. It's the video. From last spring. The one. Linda's head whipped toward her. What video? She asked too fast. Tyler's girlfriend looked at him for half a beat, some private conversation ricocheting between them, and then back at the rest of us. The one of Grandma, she said, voice shaking but steadying itself mid-sentence. The one where she held up her phone. On the screen, paused at the first frame, was Grandma on the porch in her summer sweater, the one with the small embroidered flowers. The timestamp in the corner read May 18th, 8:07 p.m. I recognized the angle. Whoever filmed it had been sitting in the wicker chair opposite her. The video title was just a date. No description, no title like a headline. But below it, in the tiny preview of the first few seconds, was Grandma lifting a sealed red-stickered envelope that looked exactly like the one under Linda's hand. The room inhaled. Tyler closed his eyes for a second like he could change a detail of the past by focusing hard enough on the present. When he opened them, he looked at me, not his mother. He looked afraid and also, strangely, relieved, like he'd been holding a heavy box all year and someone had finally opened a door. "Play it," Aunt Marlene said, her voice picking up an authority she didn't know she had until tonight. The quartet lowered their bows all the way this time and leaned in like everyone else. Linda's hand flattened harder over the real envelope, as if proximity could erase evidence. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "This circus ends now. We are going home." She reached for Tyler's wrist, a gesture so practiced it could have been reflex. He didn't move. I took one step closer to the memory table, not to block or to anchor, just to be near the place where the two versions of the night were touching. Mr. Abrams glanced at me, then at the phone, then at Linda. He adjusted his glasses like the next minutes had been underlined in an email I hadn't read. "Play it," my mother said, almost apologetically, like she was asking for a song she knew the quartet already had cued. Tyler's girlfriend's thumb hovered over the triangle. The room held its breath in that particular way rooms do when something is about to be said that can't be unsaid. Linda's jaw worked, crafting a sentence that could build a wall fast enough to stop a moving car. And then, without looking at his mother, Tyler reached out and gently lifted her hand off the envelope. He didn't rip or push. He slid her fingers away like removing a leaf from a book. Linda stared at him, shocked at the new angle of gravity. He didn't meet her eyes. He looked at Mr. Abrams, then at me, then at the phone. "Play it," he said. The little triangle brightened. Grandma's voice filled the old hall, summer and rasp, and that low musical cadence she used when something mattered. "Nathan," she said to whoever was behind the camera, and then, "Linda," clear as the lantern light. The hall went so still you could hear marshmallows sinking in cocoa. That's exactly when the front doors swung wider and a winter gust curled in, carrying with it a crowd sound from outside and a figure obscured by the swirl. A familiar silhouette stepped over the threshold, stomping snow from boots, lifting a hat. And the screen in Tyler's girlfriend's hands flickered as if the past itself had taken a breath. Grandma's voice on the little screen had a rhythm that silenced everything else. It was both familiar and new, the way she always started important sentences with a pause, like she was making space for you to lean in. "Nathan," she said again, smiling toward whoever held the camera. "And Linda, since I know you'll listen in whether or not this is meant for you. Tonight, I'm making something official." She held up the same envelope that sat under Mr. Abrams's arm, sealed with the red sticker. "This letter, you'll have it later, but I want my words on film too, because people can argue with paper. They can't argue with the sound of your mother's voice." Linda's hand twitched in the air, as though she could snatch the video out of existence. But the phone kept playing. "I've lived a long time watching what happens when one person tries to hold all the strings," Grandma continued. "It strangles the joy out of people. Families need more than one voice, more than one place to sit at the table. So I've made choices to make sure no one." She glanced straight at the lens, and somehow it felt like straight at Linda, "can turn love into control." Murmurs rippled through the hall. The kids in knit hats stopped fidgeting. Even the quartet musicians held their bows midair, as if the music they had tuned for belonged to this voice instead. Grandma leaned forward in the video. "Linda, you love fiercely, but you confuse possession with care. You will not inherit this house. You will not inherit decision-making. You will inherit my recipes, my photo albums, and my hope that someday you learn that leadership is service. Nathan will manage the trust because he listens before he speaks. And to the rest of you," she waved her hand like she was blessing the whole room, "don't let holidays become cages. Open doors for one another." The screen flickered to black. The silence afterward felt like snow falling inside the hall. Linda's face was pale, her jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. "This is manipulative," she snapped. "You can't possibly think." But she stopped when she realized no one was nodding along. Not a cousin, not a neighbor, not even Tyler. He looked at the phone in his girlfriend's hands, then at me, then at the floor. "I knew about the video," he admitted quietly, guilt spilling through his voice. "She made me promise to keep it until tonight. I didn't know how to," he swallowed. "I didn't know how to go against you, Mom. I'm sorry." Linda's lips parted like she'd been slapped. For the first time in years, she had no quick retort, no cutting remark. She stood rooted, every inch of her control crumbling in a room that no longer obeyed her. Mr. Abrams unfolded the envelope with slow precision. "Florence asked me to read this once her family had gathered," he said. "Since her words have already begun, it seems right to finish them." He drew out the letter, pages lined with the same curling script I'd seen in every birthday card she ever wrote. He began to read. Instructions for the trust, reassurances about fairness, but also small, piercing truths. She named the people she wanted thanked, the values she hoped would last, and the exact phrase that made my mother cry into her sleeve. "Emma, you are my gentlest daughter. Don't let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness." When the letter ended, the room erupted in applause, not polite clapping, but the kind that comes when tension breaks and everyone decides together which side they're on. People rose to their feet. Some hugged, some laughed through tears. My mother leaned her head on my shoulder, whispering. She saw everything. Everything. Linda tried one last time. "This spectacle doesn't change tradition," she hissed. But her words fell flat, swallowed by the swell of carols as the quartet began again. This time the music didn't wait for permission. The room sang along, voices shaky at first, then stronger, a chorus of people reclaiming what belonged to all of us. Linda gathered her bag, stiff with outrage, and stormed toward the door. Tyler lingered, torn. Finally, he shook his head and stayed behind, slipping his hand back into his girlfriend's. "I'm done pretending," he said softly. Linda left alone, boots crunching down the frozen steps, her shadow shrinking against the snow. I didn't follow her. I didn't gloat. I stood in the glow of the hall, watching neighbors and relatives line up to sign the memory book, drop coins and bills into the jars, and share stories about Grandma that stitched warmth back into the cold December night. My little gift, the framed photo, sat on the table where everyone could see it. People pointed at the ridiculous squash in Grandma's arms and laughed, and in that laughter she was alive again. As the night wound down, I stepped outside. Snow had started to fall in steady flakes, softening the edges of the world. My mother joined me, her breath making little clouds in the air. She slipped her arm through mine. "You did it," she said. "You gave us back Christmas." "No," I answered, watching the hall glow behind us. "She did. I just opened the door." We stood there a while, the sound of carols spilling out into the winter street, until even the stars seemed to hum along. And for the first time in years, I felt like I truly belonged, not because someone allowed me to, but because no one could take it away again.